In January 1945, tensions between two of World War II's most prominent generals reached their breaking. At the heart of the conflict, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower was fed up with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Known for his brilliance on the battlefield, but infamous for his arrogance and persistent undermining of American leadership, Montgomery had pushed Eisenhower to the limit. What happened in that meeting in Versailles would reshape the future of Allied command and force Montgomery to face reality. It was January 1945, and the weight of the war was beginning to feel unbearable. The Allies had been fighting for years, but behind the front lines, there was another battle brewing, one not fought with weapons, but with egos, authority, and pride. For months, Dwight D. Eisenhower had patiently dealt with the frustrations of his British counterpart, Bernard Montgomery, who seemed to challenge every decision Eisenhower made. But the time for diplomacy had run out. The last straw came after Montgomery's infamous press conference in early January 1945, where he took credit for the American victory in the Battle of the Bulge, undermining both American commanders and the unity of the Allies. For Eisenhower, a man known for his calm, patient demeanor and diplomatic skill, Montgomery's behavior was no longer tolerable. Montgomery, who had been a brilliant tactician, was also a man with a massive ego, someone who believed that the Allied war effort would be more successful if he were in charge. He had been trying to position himself as the de facto leader of the campaign in Europe, lobbying Winston Churchill for more power and using his media presence to make it clear that he saw himself as the mastermind behind every Allied victory. The relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery had been strained for months, but it wasn't always like this. In the early days of the war, Montgomery was an inspiring figure, celebrated for his victory at El Alamein in 1942. But as the war dragged on, his arrogance grew, and his inability to work cooperatively with American leadership became more pronounced. Montgomery consistently undermined American commanders, like Omar Bradley and George Patton, dismissing their strategy and questioning their decisions in front of the press. It wasn't just about strategic differences, it was about respect, or the lack of it. Montgomery's behavior toward Eisenhower was disrespectful, but Eisenhower had always been the bigger man, choosing to keep the peace rather than escalate the conflict. After all, the success of the war effort depended on the cooperation between the British and the Americans. But as the war progressed, Eisenhower realized that maintaining this cooperation required a more direct approach, one that might challenge Montgomery's arrogance head-on. The breaking point came after Montgomery's press conference on January 7, 1945. In it, Montgomery claimed credit for saving the Americans during the Battle of the Bulge, presenting himself as the savior of the situation. This was the moment that Eisenhower could no longer ignore the damage Montgomery was causing. The press was outraged, American generals were furious, and Montgomery had overstepped one too many times. It was clear that the Allied command structure was at risk of falling apart if this continued. Eisenhower had always been diplomatic, but this time he was done with Montgomery's behavior. He knew something had to be done, and quickly, or the unity between the American and British forces would collapse. He called Montgomery to a meeting at his headquarters in Versailles, a private session that would become one of the most decisive moments of the war. Before the meeting, Eisenhower was resolute. He had had enough of Montgomery's undermining tactics. According to accounts from his staff, Eisenhower told his close advisors, "If Montgomery can't accept my authority, then he can go home." There was no room for further discussion. The time for diplomacy had passed. Eisenhower was ready to assert his authority. Montgomery, for his part, probably expected another round of strategic discussions. He was used to getting his way in such meetings, or at least having his opinions heard. But when he walked into Eisenhower's office in Versailles, he found himself face to face with a man who was no longer willing to play by the rules. Eisenhower, who had always been patient and accommodating, was now visibly irritated and ready to take action. The meeting began with Eisenhower addressing Montgomery's recent action head-on. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or small talk. He told Montgomery that his press conference had caused serious damage to the unity of the Allied forces. "American generals are furious," Eisenhower said. "The press is calling for your dismissal, and frankly, I can't blame them." Montgomery, ever the diplomat, tried to justify himself. He claimed that he had been praising the American forces and that his remarks had been misunderstood. But Eisenhower was having none of it. "I don't care about your intention," Eisenhower replied sharply. "What matters is the result. And the result is that you've made the Americans question whether this is a true partnership, or whether we're just here to provide men and material for British glory." Eisenhower's words were blunt and direct. Montgomery had crossed a line. Eisenhower made it clear that he was the one in charge. "You seem to believe you should be running this campaign," Eisenhower continued. "Let me make it perfectly clear. You're not running this campaign. I am. Montgomery, stunned, opened his mouth to protest, but Eisenhower wasn't done. He stood up from his desk, walked toward Montgomery, and looked him directly in the eye. "You have two choices, Bernard," he said. "You can accept my authority without reservation, stop lobbying Churchill for my job, stop criticizing American generals, and stop giving press conferences that undermine Allied unity, or you can refuse, and I'll personally request your relief from command. Those are your only options." The message was clear. Montgomery could either fall in line and accept the chain of command, or he could leave. The choice was his. The room was silent as Montgomery absorbed Eisenhower's words. He was no longer the respected British commander who could sway opinions with his strategic genius and arrogance. He was now faced with a hard truth. Eisenhower was asserting his authority, and there was no room for negotiation. Montgomery's usual self-assuredness faltered for the first time in months. For a man who had built his reputation on unshakable confidence, this moment was a blow to his ego. Montgomery tried to push back, as expected. He was a master at justifying his actions, at spinning the narrative to fit his desire. "I was merely explaining the situation," Montgomery began, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "The northern sector was under my command. I had operational control." But Eisenhower wasn't interested in detail. He wasn't concerned with Montgomery's tactical genius or his operational control. What mattered was the larger picture, the unity of the Allies, and the importance of cohesion within the command structure. "I don't care about operational details," Eisenhower cut him off, his voice cold and firm. "This isn't about who commanded what sector. This is about whether you understand your role in this alliance. You're not the supreme commander. You're a subordinate commander. And if you can't accept that, then you're no longer useful to me." Montgomery, still reeling from the bluntness of Eisenhower's words, had no real rebuttal. For a moment, he seemed to lose his composure. The great Montgomery, who had always been so certain of his place in history, now appeared small and vulnerable. Eisenhower, seeing that Montgomery was struggling to find his footing, pressed on. "I've defended you in the past. I defended you after your disagreements with Patton, after your delays at Cannes, and after your many complaints about American leadership, but I can't defend you anymore. Not after this." Montgomery's face paled. This wasn't just about military strategy. This was about respect, about the foundation of the entire Allied operation. Eisenhower wasn't just confronting Montgomery's military decisions. He was challenging Montgomery's very place in the alliance. "You're a brilliant tactician," Eisenhower continued, his voice now more measured, but no less authoritative. "No one disputes that. But you lack political judgment. And in a coalition war, political judgment matters as much as tactical skill. Without it, we don't have unity. Without unity, we don't win." The words hit Montgomery hard. He had never been one to consider the political ramifications of his action. He was a soldier, a man of action, someone who believed that victory could be achieved with sheer force of will. But here, in this office, Eisenhower was laying bare the realities of leadership in a coalition war. Montgomery tried once more, but it was clear that Eisenhower had made up his mind. He couldn't go back. The die had been cast. "I was simply trying to ensure that our forces could work together effectively," Montgomery said, but his words were now hollow. Eisenhower stood tall, his presence commanding, as he delivered the final blow. "No. This isn't about ensuring effectiveness. It's about you accepting your place in the command structure. The Americans are now the dominant force in this theater. We're fielding more division, providing more equipment, and bearing more casualties than Britain. That's not a criticism. It's a fact. And that means American concerns must be heard. When American generals tell me they can't work with you, I have to listen. When the press questions our unity because of your remarks, I have to respond." It was a bitter pill for Montgomery to swallow. The British, once the dominant power in the Allied forces, were now in a secondary position. The war had changed, and with it, the balance of power had shifted. Eisenhower's blunt assessment of the situation left no room for misunderstanding. The American war effort was the driving force now, and Montgomery would have to fall in line. But Eisenhower wasn't done. He knew that Montgomery still didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation, so he delivered one final message. "You will now work with Bradley as an equal, not as a superior. You will stop lobbying Churchill for changes to the command structure. You will clear any press statements through my headquarters before making them, and you will conduct yourself in a way that reinforces Allied unity, not undermines. If you agree to these terms, we'll move forward together. If not, I will speak to Churchill and request your relief. The choice is yours, and I need an answer now." Montgomery, in the face of Eisenhower's unyielding authority, had no choice but to capitulate. He knew that any further resistance would not only cost him his position, but would also ruin the fragile alliance. The American generals would never accept him after this. He had pushed too far. "I accept your terms," Montgomery said, the words stiff and begrudging. You have my full cooperation. It was a moment of pure concession. Montgomery had been broken not physically, but in terms of his influence and power. He had been forced to acknowledge Eisenhower's supremacy, and in doing so, he had lost much of his former standing within the Allied command. Eisenhower stood for a moment, studying Montgomery. Then, he nodded once, firmly. Good. Then we understand each other. This meeting is over. As Montgomery left the room, Eisenhower sat at his desk in silence for several moments. He had done what was necessary, but it had cost him. He had never wanted to confront Montgomery in this way, but the reality of leadership in a coalition war had forced his hand. He turned to his chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, and said, "I should have done that 6 months ago, Smith." Ever the loyal aide agreed, though he knew the consequences of this confrontation would ripple through the entire Allied command. The British wouldn't like it, but they would understand. Churchill, once he heard about the confrontation, would have no choice but to accept it. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably, and there was no going back. As Montgomery left Eisenhower's office, he must have felt the weight of his defeat hanging heavily on him. It wasn't just a loss of power, but a blow to his identity as one of the war's most brilliant and proud commanders. For years, he had seen himself as an indispensable leader, a man whose strategies had won major battles and who could take credit for shaping the war's outcome. Now, his influence over the American forces was finished, and the alliance he had once helped lead was moving on without him. But Montgomery was not a man who easily accepted defeat. His pride would not let him show his true feelings publicly. Instead, he was forced to maintain a veneer of cooperation. In the days that followed, Montgomery wrote a formal letter to Eisenhower, pledging his full cooperation and expressing his confidence in Eisenhower's leadership. It was a letter that many of his peers recognized as a sign of Montgomery's forced submission. For a man who had once been vocal in his criticism, this sudden humility was out of character. It was a stark indication that Eisenhower's authority had been firmly established, and Montgomery had no choice but to fall in line. Eisenhower, meanwhile, was clear-eyed about the need to restore order to the Allied command structure. His actions were not just about personal grudges or settling a dispute with Montgomery. They were about maintaining the unity of the coalition and ensuring that the war effort continued smoothly. He had known all along that leadership in a coalition requires not just military brilliance, but also the ability to manage egos, mediate conflicts, and assert authority when necessary. The moment he had faced Montgomery in that office had been difficult, but it had been necessary. In the aftermath, the Allied command structure quickly adapted to the new reality. Montgomery was still in command of the British and Canadian forces in the northern sector, but he was no longer the influential figure he had been. From that moment on, Montgomery's ability to influence American strategy and operations was severely limited. Eisenhower, now fully in control, made sure to involve American generals like Bradley and Patton directly in the planning for the final push into Germany. Montgomery, despite his previous position of power, was now treated like any other subordinate commander. The subtle yet unmistakable demotion had been made clear to everyone in the command structure. As the war moved into its final stages, Montgomery was kept at a distance from the most critical decisions. When American forces prepared to cross the Rhine River, Montgomery was not consulted. His ideas were no longer considered vital to the overall strategy. The very generals he had once looked down upon now had direct access to Eisenhower, and Montgomery was left to execute orders rather than shape the course of the war. His public stance on Allied unity had been undermined, and his reputation, though still respected, was tarnished. The true extent of Eisenhower's victory in that confrontation became even more evident as the weeks went by. While Montgomery grudgingly accepted his new position, the tension between the British and American forces persisted, albeit under the surface. The British military hierarchy, especially Churchill, was not pleased with the way Montgomery had been dealt with, but they understood that Eisenhower had no choice. The political realities of the war had shifted, and the Americans were now the dominant force in the Western theater. If Britain wanted to remain a key player, it had to accept the new balance of power. Churchill, upon learning of the confrontation, did not put up a fight. His response, as documented in British records, was pragmatic. Eisenhower has asserted his authority. He told his military chief, "About time, I'd say." Montgomery needed to hear it. This acknowledgement from Churchill himself was a rare moment of agreement between the two leaders. It demonstrated that even the British Prime Minister recognized that Eisenhower's leadership was essential for maintaining the cohesion of the alliance. The confrontation at Versailles had broader implications than just the relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery. It marked a turning point in the war, one where the balance of power within the Anglo-American alliance shifted decisively in favor of the United States. As American forces grew stronger and more numerous, the British, though still important, found themselves in a secondary position. Montgomery's refusal to accept this reality had almost destroyed the unity of the Allied forces. Eisenhower's decisive action not only salvaged the relationship, but also ensured that the war effort would continue without further disruption. While Montgomery did not immediately fade into obscurity, his influence was never the same. The events of January 1945 had permanently altered the power dynamics within the Allied command structure. The war was still being fought, but the leadership that had guided the Allies to victory would never be the same. Montgomery's rise to prominence had been a result of his military skill and his relationships with British leaders like Churchill. However, it was his inability to accept the growing American dominance that led to his downfall. Eisenhower's leadership, which had been tested under pressure, now stood unchallenged. Montgomery, always a proud man, never publicly acknowledged the true extent of his defeat. He continued to write about his experiences after the war, but his memoirs were notably restrained when it came to his interactions with Eisenhower. Those who knew him well understood that the man who had once been so vocal in his criticisms was now silenced. His later statements on Eisenhower were respectful, almost deferential, but they lacked the fire that had characterized Montgomery's earlier behavior. For Eisenhower, the confrontation with Montgomery was a difficult but necessary moment in his leadership. As he later reflected in private, the confrontation was one of the hardest things he had to do during the war, but it was also one of the most important. He understood that maintaining unity among the Allies was vital to winning the war. Sometimes, diplomacy had to take a back seat to raw authority. And in this case, Eisenhower's use of authority had prevented a potential crisis from spiraling out of control. The ripple effects of Eisenhower's confrontation with Montgomery reached far beyond their immediate exchange. In the aftermath, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere within the Allied command. Montgomery, once a towering figure of British military strategy, now found himself marginalized. The world saw him as a subordinate, a respected but increasingly irrelevant figure who no longer held sway over the Allied decision-making process. For Eisenhower, the victory was not one of personal triumph, but one of necessity. It wasn't about proving who was in charge or settling a personal grudge. It was about the integrity of the Allied forces, the success of the war effort, and the critical need for unity. His command of the situation was a hard-earned realization that maintaining peace and cooperation often required more than just diplomacy. Sometimes leadership demanded a firm hand. In the days and weeks following the confrontation, Montgomery's actions appeared to be more subdued. He sent the obligatory letter to Eisenhower, formally acknowledging his new role within the command structure. The letter, though politely worded, was unmistakably a gesture of compliance, one that seemed forced but necessary. While Montgomery continued to command the British and Canadian forces in the northern sector, he knew that his influence over the American strategy was forever gone. Eisenhower's leadership, on the other hand, became even more consolidated. The respect he had earned through years of patience and diplomacy now translated into absolute control. Eisenhower's decisiveness in the meeting with Montgomery had sent a clear message to both his American and British subordinates. The US was now the dominant force in the Western theater, and any challenges to that authority would not be tolerated. In Montgomery's eyes, the defeat was a bitter one. For the remainder of the war, Montgomery continued to serve in his role, but his influence in the planning of major operations was sharply limited. As the final stages of the war approached, Eisenhower, working closely with American generals like Bradley and Patton, took direct control over the crucial planning for the invasion of Germany and the push toward Berlin. Montgomery, once the linchpin of the Allied offensive in Europe, was now relegated to a secondary role. His ideas no longer considered central to the Allied strategy. The humiliation was especially evident in the planning for the final stages of the war. As American forces prepared to cross the Rhine River and push deep into Germany, Montgomery was not consulted. His presence in the strategic discussions was minimal. Eisenhower's office, which had once been a place for Montgomery to make his case for greater control, now became a place where the American generals Bradley, Patton, and others were directly shaping the outcome of the war. Montgomery, despite his past fame and stature, was not part of these conversations. It wasn't that Montgomery's skills had suddenly evaporated. His tactical brilliance was still evident in his handling of the British and Canadian forces. However, the greater concern for Eisenhower was not how Montgomery performed in his own sector, but how his behavior was affecting the overall unity of the Allied force. It was clear that Montgomery's egotistical drive for control, combined with his inability to accept the shifting power dynamics within the alliance, had made him a liability. Eisenhower had to act decisively to ensure that the American-led strategy would not be undermined further. Montgomery's failure to understand the changing nature of the war also reflected a broader shift in the balance of power between the British and the American. When the war began, Britain's military influence had been far stronger, but by January 1945, the United States had clearly become the dominant force. American industrial production, manpower, and resources outpaced those of Britain by a wide margin. Montgomery's refusal to acknowledge this reality had cost him dearly. His political misjudgment, compounded by his combative nature, had created the crisis that Eisenhower had to resolve. As the war came to a close in Europe, the shift in the Allied leadership structure became more apparent. The Americans were now in charge, and Montgomery's role had been relegated to that of a subordinate commander, one who would no longer shape the grand strategy. Eisenhower's ability to wield authority in the moment of crisis had solidified his leadership in a way that no diplomatic maneuver could have achieved, while Montgomery would continue to command forces on the battlefield. His influence over the war's course was effectively nullified. The confrontation had not only humiliated Montgomery, but had also reshaped the Anglo-American alliance. Churchill, despite his personal loyalty to Montgomery, understood the necessity of Eisenhower's action. While he might have been displeased by Montgomery's treatment, he recognized that Eisenhower's leadership had been essential to maintaining the cohesion of the alliance. The British military establishment, although unhappy with the outcome, had little choice but to accept the reality of American dominance. In retrospect, the confrontation between Eisenhower and Montgomery in January 1945 can be seen as a turning point in the war. It marked the moment when the Americans fully took control of the Western theater, when Eisenhower's authority was no longer questioned, and when the rift between the British and American forces was finally healed, though at the cost of Montgomery's reputation and influence. The aftermath of the confrontation also spoke volumes about the necessity of strong leadership in wartime. Eisenhower's willingness to take action, even when it meant alienating a respected British general, demonstrated the importance of maintaining discipline and unity in a coalition. Sometimes, the fate of a warrant, the success of an alliance hinges not just on battlefield victories, but on the ability to navigate complex political dynamics, balance egos, and assert authority when the situation demands it. Montgomery, for all his brilliance on the battlefield, had been unable to grasp this. His failure to adapt to the new power dynamics in the war ultimately led to his downfall. His public defiance of Eisenhower's authority, his inability to accept the primacy of American leadership, and his insistence on trying to take control all played a part in his demotion. The final chapter of Montgomery's war was written not on the battle, but in the office of Dwight D. Eisenhower, where Montgomery's fate was sealed by a single, uncompromising act of authority. As the war continued and the Allies pressed onward toward the defeat of Nazi Germany, the dynamic within the Allied command grew ever more evident. Eisenhower's leadership remained unchallenged, and Montgomery, despite his continued role in commanding British and Canadian forces, was relegated to the periphery of strategic decision-making. His public displays of discontent and failure to grasp the reality of the shifting power dynamic had left him without the influence he once held. In the wake of the confrontation, Montgomery's every action was scrutinized. He was forced to toe the line, aligning himself with Eisenhower's decision, even if his pride and ego were bruised by the reality of his diminished role. Gone were the days when he could make bold pronouncements to the press, claiming credit for victories or undermining American commanders. Eisenhower's swift action had effectively closed off any further challenges to his authority. The American-led strategy, now firmly in place, proceeded without further interference from Montgomery. Eisenhower's decision to involve Bradley and Patton directly in the planning for the final offensive into Germany was a clear sign of the shift in power. The American generals were in charge of the major operation. Montgomery's forces, while still important, were no longer central to the planning or execution of the decisive strikes. Montgomery's diminished influence wasn't a result of a lack of competence or valor in battle. His tactical acumen remained sharp, and his role in leading the British forces on the battlefield was respected. However, his inability to work work within the framework of the broader Allied command, combined with his refusal to accept the American dominance, made him an increasingly problematic figure. The final push into Germany, the crossing of the Rhine, and the subsequent battles all unfolded without significant input from Montgomery. When American forces moved across the river and advanced deeper into German territory, Montgomery's forces were not consulted. Eisenhower's leadership had firmly solidified the American presence at the center of the Allied strategy. Montgomery was left to follow orders, executing his role in a way that reinforced the new reality. The Americans were calling the shot. But while Montgomery outwardly complied, the frustration he felt inside could not be completely hidden. The British general, who had once been a commanding presence in every room he entered, was now a subordinator role he was ill-equipped to handle with grace. His once vocal confidence was replaced with a quiet, reluctant submission. Even as he conducted himself professionally in the public eye, Montgomery knew that his place in the war had fundamentally changed. The moment that Eisenhower had decisively asserted his authority had set the tone for the remainder of the war. Montgomery's defiance had not only been a challenge to Eisenhower personally, but it had also posed a threat to the unity of the Allied forces. The stakes were too high for Eisenhower to allow such disunity to fester. By confronting Montgomery in the way he did, Eisenhower had prevented a potential fracture from deepening. His leadership had preserved the cohesion necessary to defeat the Nazis. The final stages of the war saw Montgomery relegated to a less influential role, but his ego was not easily subdued. In the months after the confrontation, Montgomery continued to work within the confines of his command. However, the loss of influence weighed heavily on him. Even as he continued to play a part in the final stages of the war, the understanding that his ability to shape the outcome was gone lingered in his mind. After the war, Montgomery's memoirs reflected a man who had been forced to come to terms with his diminished role in the final Allied victories. In his post-war writing, Montgomery was surprisingly restrained in his commentary on Eisenhower. This was a stark contrast to his usual free-spirited criticisms of those he disagreed with. In the face of his defeat, Montgomery, for the first time in his career, appeared to acknowledge his place within the larger picture, accepting that the leadership of the Allies had shifted irreparably. Eisenhower, on the other hand, remained diplomatic in his reflections on Montgomery. While he acknowledged Montgomery's military genius, he made it clear in private conversations that the decision to confront him had been necessary. Eisenhower's ability to assert his authority, despite his personal affection for Montgomery, was a testament to his growth as a leader. Eisenhower, who had spent so much of his career mediating disputes and managing egos, had reached a point where leadership required an uncompromising stance. In private, Eisenhower admitted that the confrontation with Montgomery had been one of the hardest decisions of his leadership. Yet, he also recognized that it was a pivotal moment in securing Allied unity. As he reflected on the actions he had taken, Eisenhower saw the confrontation not as a personal victory, but as a necessary step for the greater good. In this moment, he had proven that the success of the Allied effort came before personal grievances, before diplomacy, and before national pride. Montgomery, meanwhile, would never forget the meeting. It had been a humiliating experience, one that had stripped him of his confidence and forced him to face the reality that he was no longer the central figure in the Allied command. He would continue to serve in his role for the remainder of the war, but his reputation would never fully recover from the damage done in that meeting. In the end, Eisenhower had won not through brilliance or public popularity, but through the raw exercise of authority. He had put his foot down when necessary, reminding the Allies and Montgomery that the war effort required more than individual ego. Leadership was about unity, cooperation, and the willingness to put the greater good above personal pride. And as history would show, Eisenhower's victory in this confrontation was not just important for the Allies in 1905, but it served as a critical lesson in leadership that would resonate far beyond the war. The success of the Allied campaign was not just due to military victories, but also to the unity Eisenhower had worked tirelessly to preserve, unity that, in the final moments, required a decisive and unyielding display of authority. As the war in Europe neared its end, the ripples of Eisenhower's decision to confront Montgomery continued to be felt across the Allied forces. The American victory had become a reality, not only because of the efforts on the battlefield, but also due to the political and strategic unity that Eisenhower had managed to enforce. The rift between the American and British leadership, while far from healed, was at least temporarily stabilized. Eisenhower had set the terms for cooperation, and those terms were clear. The American-led command structure would be upheld, and there would be no more room for insubordination or division. For Montgomery, however, the effects of that fateful meeting in January lingered long after the final victory in Europe. While his military competence remained undiminished, his standing in the eyes of his peers had been forever altered. He was still a hero to many, but his influence had been irrevocably curtailed. The respect he once commanded from his fellow generals, particularly those in the American command, had diminished. Eisenhower's assertion of authority had sent a clear message. Montgomery's role was no longer central to the Allied effort. Behind the scene, the American generals who had once tolerated Montgomery's arrogance were now emboldened by Eisenhower's leadership. Generals like Bradley and Patton, who had long dealt with Montgomery's disdain, now found themselves in a position of power. They were given more say in the strategic direction of the war, and their relationship with Eisenhower was more direct than ever before. The shift in power dynamics was palpable. The Americans had taken the lead, and the British, while still vital allies, were increasingly sidelined. Montgomery, now working within the confines of the new command structure, did his best to carry on with his duty. He continued to lead British and Canadian forces in the northern sector, but his role was no longer as influential as it once had been. His actions were now scrutinized with a sharp eye. Every decision he made was watched carefully, not just by the British military, but also by Eisenhower's staff. There was little room for error, and any misstep could jeopardize his position further. Despite his limited influence, Montgomery still managed to make significant contributions to the war effort, particularly in the final stages of the conflict. He played a key role in the liberation of the Netherlands and in the final push toward Germany's defeat. However, these victories were overshadowed by the political consequences of his earlier behavior. Montgomery had always prided himself on his independence and his belief in his own superiority as a strategist. But now, he was a part of a much larger machine, one that was dominated by American leadership. Eisenhower's decision to confront Montgomery wasn't just about the present, it was about shaping the future of the Allies. He knew that the war was nearing its end, but he also understood that the post-war landscape would require careful management. The unity of the Allies was crucial, not just for the victory over Nazi Germany, but for the delicate political environment that would follow. Eisenhower's ability to maintain that unity, even if it meant making difficult decisions, like the one with Montgomery, was a testament to his foresight and leadership. In the aftermath of the war, Eisenhower's leadership was widely praised. He was hailed as a hero, the man who had led the Allies to victory and ensured that the coalition remained intact. His ability to manage the egos of the various Allied leaders, Churchill, Roosevelt, and de Gaulle, among others, was seen as a masterclass in diplomacy. However, as time passed, the complexities of his leadership became more apparent. The decision to confront Montgomery had not been easy, but it was ultimately necessary. It was a moment that defined Eisenhower's legacy as a leader, showing that even in the most delicate of alliances, there were times when hard choices had to be made. For Montgomery, the post-war years were marked by a slow but steady decline in influence. While he continued to serve in various military roles, he was never able to regain the prominence he had once enjoyed. His memoirs, when they were published, reflected a more humble Montgomery, one who had been forced to acknowledge his place in the larger picture. His earlier criticisms of Eisenhower and the American leadership were noticeably absent, replaced by a more restrained tone. In private, however, Montgomery's bitterness never fully disappeared. He had been humble, but he had not forgotten the experience of being put in his place by Eisenhower. Those who were close to him reported that he would occasionally reflect on the confrontation in Versailles, acknowledging, albeit grudgingly, that Eisenhower had been right to assert his authority. Yet, Montgomery never fully came to terms with the fact that he had lost the battle of wills in such a decisive manner. Eisenhower, on the other hand, rarely spoke about the confrontation with Montgomery in public after the war. He understood that the relationship with Britain was too important to be marred by personal animosity. In his memoirs, Eisenhower referred to Montgomery with the respect due to a fellow soldier, but there was no mention of the dramatic meet in Versailles. To Eisenhower, the confrontation was a necessary action taken to preserve the unity of the Allies, not a personal victory. However, in private conversations, Eisenhower was more candid. He acknowledged the difficulty of the confrontation, admitting that it had been one of the hardest moments of his leadership. Yet, he also recognized that it was a moment that had to happen. "I liked Monty in many ways," Eisenhower said in one of his reflections. "He was brilliant, dedicated, and genuinely cared about his men, but he couldn't see beyond his own ego. And in a coalition war, that's disqualifying. The confrontation between Eisenhower and Montgomery, though personal in nature, had profound implications for the future of the Allied command. It had not only solidified Eisenhower's leadership, but had also marked the end of an era in the Anglo-American military relationship. The war was still being fought, but the leadership dynamics had been irrevocably altered. The Americans were in charge, and the British had to accept this new reality if they wanted to continue to play a central role in the post-war world. As the war came to a close, Montgomery's legacy was sealed. He remained a respected figure in British military history, but his influence over the strategic direction of the war had been extinguished. Eisenhower, by contrast, emerged as the undisputed leader of the Allied forces, a man whose decisiveness and ability to exercise authority when necessary had ensured victory. The story of their confrontation in Versailles became a lesson for future leaders in times of crisis. Leadership requires more than just diplomacy, requires the courage to take bold action, even when it means confronting your most difficult subordinates. As the war in Europe came to a close, the results of Eisenhower's confrontation with Montgomery became even clearer. The victory over Nazi Germany was celebrated across the world. But behind the scene, the changes in the Allied command structure were irreversible. Eisenhower's firm hand in dealing with Montgomery had not only preserved the unity of the Allied forces, but had also solidified American leadership for the post-war world. The uneasy balance of power between Britain and America during the war was now firmly tipped in favor of the United States. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the impact of the Versailles confrontation lingered, though it was not openly discussed in public forum. The war's end had led to a sense of cautious optimism, with Allied leaders eager to rebuild and restructure the world. Yet, the political realities that had shaped the course of the war, especially Eisenhower's assertive leadership, were not easily forgotten. Montgomery, who had long been one of the most outspoken figures in the British military, found himself in an awkward position. Though he was still a war hero, the influence he once wielded over the strategic direction of the war was gone. He spent the next few years in various military and political roles, but his reputation was now permanently shadowed by his confrontation with Eisenhower. While Montgomery maintained a degree of respect among his peers in the British military, he was no longer seen as the formidable leader he once was. His public statements and actions were now more measured, less confident, and often restrained. There was a clear, unspoken understanding among those who had witnessed the confrontation that Montgomery's former bravado had been replaced by a quiet humility. Eisenhower, on the other hand, had moved into a position of even greater prominence. His leadership during the war was widely celebrated, and as the first supreme Allied commander, he had orchestrated the successful defeat of the Nazis. But it was his decision to confront Montgomery that truly defined his legacy as a leader. Eisenhower's ability to stand firm in the face of internal opposition was a demonstration of his strength as a commander, and it sent a powerful message to all future military and political leaders. Unity and clear leadership were essential in times of crisis, and the success of an alliance depended on the willingness to make difficult decisions. While Eisenhower rarely spoke about the confrontation with Montgomery after the war, his actions made the message clear. The American-led Allied command structure had prevailed, and Eisenhower had successfully solidified his position as the leader of the post-war world order. Montgomery's inability to accept this new reality, his refusal to adjust to the shifting balance of power, had cost him dearly. The political dynamics that defined the post-war landscape were now firmly established. The United States had emerged from the war as the dominant global superpower, and the British, though still influential, had to accept their subordinate role. The end of the war marked the beginning of a new era of international relations, where American leadership would guide the rebuilding of Europe and the world. This new reality was something Montgomery struggled to accept, but it was undeniable. The war had shifted the global balance of power, and Montgomery's influence was a casualty of that change. In the years that followed, Eisenhower continued to shape the world in his image. He went on to serve as the 34th President of the United States, using his leadership skills to navigate the Cold War and lead the country through a period of profound global transformation. As president, Eisenhower applied the lessons he had learned during the war, particularly the importance of coalition building, diplomatic skill, and the need to assert leadership when the situation demanded it. Montgomery, meanwhile, remained active in the military and political spheres, but never regained the prominence he once held. His memoirs, published in the years after the war, reflected a man who had come to terms with his diminished role. While his tactical brilliance was never in question, the recognition of his failure to adapt to the new leadership dynamic left a lasting mark on his legacy. The confrontation in Versailles was not just a pivotal moment in the war, it was a turning point in history. It marked the moment when American leadership of the Allied forces was cemented, and when the political reality of the post-war world became clear. Eisenhower's ability to confront Montgomery, a man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in the Allied command, demonstrated that leadership was about more than just military skill. It was about the ability to make hard decisions, to preserve unity, and to navigate the complexities of international relationships. The relationship between Britain and the United States was never easy. The war had brought both nations together, but it had also highlighted the differences in their approaches to leadership and strategy. Eisenhower, as the American commander, had to navigate these tensions while maintaining the broader goal of defeating the Axis power. His decision to confront Montgomery was a testament to his ability to prioritize the greater good of the Allied cause over individual egos and national pride. For Montgomery, the confrontation served as a reminder of the limits of his influence. His personal ambition, once so powerful, had led him to challenge Eisenhower's authority. But in the end, it was Eisenhower's leadership that prevailed, and Montgomery was forced to accept his place within the larger structure of the Allied command. In the years that followed, both men went on to leave lasting marks on history, but their relationship was forever shaped by that moment in Versailles. Eisenhower's actions that day would define his leadership and legacy, proving that sometimes the greatest challenges a leader faces are not on the battlefield, but within their own rank. As Eisenhower's leadership remained dominant in the final push against Nazi Germany, the consequences of his confrontation with Montgomery continued to resonate within the ranks of the Allied force. Eisenhower's ability to assert control in a time of crisis and manage the various egos within the alliance became one of the defining qualities of his leadership. While Montgomery's tactical genius was never in question, his failure to adapt to the changing leadership dynamics and his refusal to recognize American dominance within the Allied structure left him marginalized. Even after the war, Montgomery's standing was never quite the same. His memoirs, which he published after the conflict, are remarkably restrained in their assessment of Eisenhower. For a man known for his bold statements and outspokenness, Montgomery's reflection on his relationship with Eisenhower was significantly more measured. In private, however, those who were close to Montgomery noted his lingering bitterness over the confrontation. He never fully accepted his diminished role in the post-war world order and the diminishing of his influence within the Allied forces. The aftermath of the confrontation was felt most profoundly in the reorganization of the post-war military structure. The United States, having emerged as the undisputed superpower, now took the lead in shaping the future of Europe. Montgomery's role in the reorganization was limited. Though he continued to hold various military positions, his influence was overshadowed by the rise of American commanders and the clear direction Eisenhower had set. As the US transitioned from wartime military leadership to Cold War diplomacy, the necessity of maintaining a strong, unified leadership under American command became undeniable. Eisenhower's ability to navigate this political shift, ensuring that his authority remained unchallenged, was crucial to maintaining stability within the Western world. Montgomery's role in the final stages of the war was still important, but the key decisions that shaped the post-war world were made without him. When American forces crossed the Rhine and began their advance into Germany, Montgomery was relegated to a secondary role. His tactical skills were still respected, but his ability to influence the overall strategy had been diminished. Eisenhower had made it clear that he was in charge, and that was a reality Montgomery was forced to accept, albeit begrudgingly. Eisenhower, now basking in the success of the war effort, had learned invaluable lessons from his experience with Montgomery. The confrontation with his British counterpart had solidified his belief in the importance of unity and the necessity of decisive action when required. The diplomatic and political nuances of coalition leadership were crucial, but sometimes leadership had to be about making hard, immediate decisions that could not be compromised. Eisenhower had understood this from the start, but his handling of Montgomery made it clear that even his patient and diplomatic demeanor had limits. Montgomery, for all his flaws, had been a brilliant commander. His victories in Africa and his role in the Normandy invasion had earned him a place in history as one of the great military minds of the 20th century. But his inability to adapt to the realities of the post-D-Day Allied command structure and his failure to recognize the primacy of American leadership had cost him dearly. In the end, Montgomery was no longer the central figure in the planning of the final defeat of Nazi Germany. He was now a subordinate, with his previous influence greatly diminished. For Eisenhower, the victory over Montgomery was not about personal triumph, but about the greater good of the Allied forces. He had been patient, diplomatic, and strategic in managing the egos of the many powerful leaders he worked with. But when Montgomery's behavior became a threat to the unity of the Allies, Eisenhower acted decisively. The message was clear. Any challenges to his authority would not be tolerated, and the success of the war effort required unity, not individual egos. As Eisenhower settled into his post-war role, first as the head of the American occupation of Germany, and then as president, his leadership style remained consistent. The lessons he learned during the war, particularly during his confrontation with Montgomery, continued to inform his decisions. Eisenhower's ability to manage complex international relationships, to navigate the intricacies of global diplomacy, and to assert authority when necessary, became his hallmark as both a military leader and a statesman. Montgomery, for his part, did not fade into obscurity. His post-war career, however, was marked by a sense of resignation. He held on to his pride as a soldier, but struggled to find his place in the new post-order. While he continued to serve in various military roles, he was no longer the central figure he had once been. His memoirs and later reflections on the war revealed a man coming to terms with his own limitations. In interviews and public appearances, Montgomery would occasionally refer to his time with Eisenhower, but his comments were careful and diplomatic. The confrontation at Versailles had left its mark on him, and although he would never publicly acknowledge the full extent of his defeat, it was clear from his demeanor and his written words that he had been forced to accept his diminished position within the Allied command. For Eisenhower, the victory in the war was not just about defeating the Nazis, but about ensuring that the post-war world was stable and secure. He understood that leadership was not just about military victories, but about managing relationships, making difficult decisions, and asserting authority when required. His confrontation with Montgomery, though personal and difficult, was a critical moment in the preservation of Allied unity. In the broader context of the war, this moment was a small but pivotal piece of the larger picture, one where Eisenhower's leadership would ultimately determine the success of the Allies. Eisenhower had achieved something that few leaders ever managed. He had unified a fractured alliance, ensured victory in Europe, and, in doing so, had cemented his legacy as one of the greatest military leaders in history. Montgomery, while still respected, had been left behind in this new era of American dominance. As the war in Europe came to an end, the reverberations of Eisenhower's confrontation with Montgomery would echo through history. The final months of the conflict showcased not only the military triumphs of the Allies, but also the political and leadership decisions that had shaped the course of the war. Eisenhower, now firmly in control, had ensured that his leadership would not be questioned again. The shift in power dynamics within the Allied command was a defining moment, not just for the war effort, but for the future of the post-war world. Eisenhower's ability to manage the fractious relationships between the Allied powers was part of his genius. The fact that the Americans had assumed the mantle of leadership in the Western Front was not only a military victory, but also a diplomatic triumph. Montgomery's defeat, at least in terms of his influence, represented the larger shift in global power. The United States was no longer just a participant in the war effort. It was now the primary force in shaping the post-war world order. And Eisenhower, as the figurehead of that dominance, had made it clear that unity, above all else, was what would win the war. While Montgomery continued to serve in the British military, his role in shaping the outcome of the war had become a mere formality. The decisions that mattered, the strategic choices for the final assault into Germany, the planning of the post-war occupation of Europe, and the direction of Allied operations were now firmly in the hands of Eisenhower and his American general. Bradley and Patton, once Montgomery's subordinates, were now directly involved in the war's final stages, their voices more important than ever before. Montgomery, despite his experience and tactical brilliance, had been marginalized. He was still a respected figure, but the essence of his command, his ability to influence strategy, was gone. Montgomery's attempt to continue his influence was met with limited success. His frustration was evident, but he could not openly challenge Eisenhower's authority without risking further isolation. The British general, who had once been the most dominant figure on the battlefield, now found himself in a secondary role, surrounded by American generals who had once been under his command. This was not a position Montgomery was accustomed to, but it was the reality he had to accept. Eisenhower's decision, however, was not one made lightly. The confrontation in Versailles was a turning point, but it was not the only challenge Eisenhower had faced. He had spent years mediating between conflicting personalities, negotiating between national interests, and finding ways to keep the Allies united in their shared goal of defeating the Axis powers. His diplomatic abilities had been tested time and time again, but the meeting with Montgomery represented something different. It was a moment where diplomacy had to give way to decisive action. Eisenhower knew that if the unity of the Allies was to be preserved, Montgomery's defiance had to be confronted head-on. The consequences of Eisenhower's leadership became even clearer in the post-war period. As the Allies turned their attention to the rebuilding of Europe and the creation of the United Nations, Eisenhower's leadership was integral to shaping the new world order. He knew that the challenges of the post-war era would require cooperation between former enemies, and maintaining a strong leadership position within the Allied powers was essential. The legacy of his actions, including his confrontation with Montgomery, was one of ensuring that American leadership remained paramount. As Eisenhower took office as President of the United States, his experiences during the war informed his decisions on the global stage. The lessons he had learned about coalition leadership, authority, and the importance of maintaining unity would shape his approach to international diplomacy. His interactions with Montgomery had reinforced the need for clarity and firm leadership, especially when dealing with allies who might be reluctant to accept a subordinate role. The confrontation with Montgomery was not just a moment in history, it was a lesson in leadership that would guide Eisenhower throughout his presidency. For Montgomery, the legacy was more complicated. His tactical genius could never be denied, but the aftermath of his clash with Eisenhower left an indelible mark on his reputation. The British general, despite his brilliance in battle, had failed to recognize the changing realities of the war and the shifting power dynamics within the Allied command. His pride, his ego, and his inability to adapt to American leadership had led to his isolation. While Montgomery continued to serve his country and hold respect as a military leader, his influence over the course of the war had been permanently curtailed. The confrontation between Eisenhower and Montgomery was more than just a moment of military strategy. It was a moment of political and psychological warfare. Eisenhower had not only defeated Montgomery's strategic influence, he had also shown that true leadership requires the courage to act decisively, even in the face of personal and political risks. In that room in Versailles, Eisenhower established the groundwork for post-war cooperation and cemented his place as a leader who was unafraid to make the tough call, no matter the consequences. The ultimate test of Eisenhower's leadership was not just in the success of the military campaigns, but in the way he held the Allied forces together. When confronted with one of his most challenging subordinates, Eisenhower did not back down. He understood that leadership was about more than just compromise. It was about ensuring that the right decisions were made for the good of all. His ability to assert his authority, to stand firm in the face of Montgomery's defiance, and to maintain the unity of the Allies was a defining moment in the war. In the years that followed, Montgomery, though still a figure of historical importance, was never quite the same. The war had humbled him, and the lessons he had learned in the aftermath of Versailles stayed with him. His memoirs, although filled with his usual brilliance and insight, were tinged with a sense of resignation. He had been forced to confront the reality of his place in the Allied command structure, and though he never fully accepted it, he could not deny that the war had irrevocably changed the balance of power within the coalition. Eisenhower, on the other hand, emerged from the war with his legacy firmly intact. He had been the one who had steered the Allies to victory, not just through military might, but through political acumen and unwavering leadership. His actions in Versailles were a testament to his strength as a leader. When faced with the challenge of maintaining unity in the face of personal and political tension, Eisenhower chose the path of decisiveness. His ability to assert control over Montgomery ensured the continued success of the Allied campaign, and in the end, that was what mattered most. The legacy of the confrontation between Eisenhower and Montgomery stands as a testament to the complexities of leadership during wartime. The harsh realities of coalition warfare, where egos, ambitions, and national interests often collide, were evident in that meeting. Eisenhower's victory was not just about proving a point to Montgomery, but about securing the future of the Allied forces and ensuring that the war effort remained focused on its ultimate goal, the defeat of Nazi Germany and the creation of a stable post-war world order.